Stanford University.
Believe it or not, and I know most people do not, violence has been in decline for long stretches of time, and we may be living in the most peaceful era in our species' existence. The decline of violence has not been steady, it has not brought rates of violence down to zero, and it is not guaranteed to continue. But I hope to persuade you that it's been a persistent historical development, visible on scales from millennia to years, from the waging of wars and perpetration of genocides to the treatment of children and animals. I'm going to walk you through 6 major declines of violence, try to identify their immediate causes, that is, particular historical events of that era, and then tie them together in terms of their ultimate causes, namely general historical forces interacting with human nature. The first decline of violence I call the pacification process. Until about 5,000 years ago, humans everywhere lived in anarchy without central government. What was life like in this state of nature? Well, this is a question that thinkers have speculated on for centuries. In 1651, Thomas Hobbes famously wrote that in a state of nature, the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. A century later, Jean-Jacques Rousseau countered that nothing can be more gentle than man in his primitive state. Now, these two gentlemen were speculating from the armchair. They didn't have any data. They didn't have big data. They didn't have small data. They didn't have any data. But today we can do better, because there are 2 sources of evidence on rates of violence in non-state societies. The first is forensic archaeology. You can think of this as CSI Paleolithic. Namely, what proportion of prehistoric skeletons have signs of violent trauma, such as bashed-in skulls, decapitations, bones found with arrowheads embedded in them, or mummies found with ropes around their necks. Here you see 21 estimates. They span quite a range, but they average out at a rate of about 15%. That is, 15% of prehistoric skeletons show signs of violent trauma. Let's compare that rate to those of some modern states, state societies such as the United States and Europe in the 20th century, with both world wars, which come in at a rate of 0.6%. If you try to get the maximal estimate by taking the world as a whole in the 20th century, adding up the direct deaths from war, the indirect deaths from starvation and disease in the wake of war, the genocides and the man-made famines, you end up at the rate of about 3% of the world's population that died of violence. Here's the graph for the world in the year 2005. The bar is less than 1 pixel high at a rate of 0.03%. The second way of estimating violence in non-state societies comes from ethnographic vital statistics. The wave of settled states and government that swept over the world starting around 5,000 years ago left a few pockets of the globe still in a state of anarchy, namely hunter-gatherer and hunter-horticultural societies. And ethnographers who've lived with them for extended periods of time have tallied their rates of death from violence and other causes. Here we have 27 estimates plotted as in terms of number of war deaths per 100,000 people per year. Once again, they span quite a range, but they average out to 524 war deaths per 100,000 per year. That is, every year, 0.5% of the population dies in warfare. Let's compare that 524 figure to those of some modern states, and I'll stack the deck against modernity by picking some of the most violent states in their most violent centuries, such as Germany in the 20th century, which endured 2 world wars and had a rate of violent death of 144 per 100,000 per year. Russia in the 20th century, 2 world wars, a civil war, and a revolution for a rate of 135. Japan in the 20th century, a world war that ended in 2 nuclear strikes with a rate of 27. Here's the United States in the 20th century, 2 world wars and at least half a dozen other foreign wars with a rate of 3.7. The world in the 20th century, and again, pumping up the rate as high as you can by throwing in all of the genocides and man-made famines. The rate is about 60 per 100,000 per year. And here is the entire world in the year 2005 with a bar less than 1 pixel high with a rate of 3/10 of a violent death per 100,000 per year. So not to put too fine a point on it, but when it comes to life in a state of nature, Hobbes was right, Rousseau was wrong. The immediate cause was the rise and expansion of states, leading to the various paxes that history students are taught, the Pax Romana, Pax Islamica, Pax Hispanica, and so on. When a state establishes control over a territory, it often tries to stamp out tribal raiding and feuding, not because the early kings and emperors had a benevolent interest in the welfare of their citizens, but rather because tribal raiding and feuding is a nuisance, since they would just as soon keep the people alive to supply them with taxes and soldiers and slaves. Two direct comparisons that it was the presence of states that made the difference. One of them from forensic archaeology consists of a survey of several hundred Native American skeletons in museum collections, all prior to the arrival of Columbus. The left-hand bar graph shows the percentage of skeletons from hunter-gatherer Native American societies that showed signs of violent trauma at a rate of 13%, very close to the 15% figure from the independent samples I presented earlier. The rate of death from the Native American state societies was less than 3%, a reduction of about a factor of 5. And from ethnographic vital statistics, the only pre-post comparison I was able to find came from two estimates of rates of homicide among the Kung San and the Kalahari Desert before the imposition of state control by Botswana and after, and there's a reduction in the homicide rate of about 25%. The second historical decline of violence can be appreciated by examining this woodcut, which shows a typical day in the life in the Middle Ages. And the process that brought this under control has been called the civilizing process. Now, it turns out that homicide statistics in many parts of Europe literally go back 800 years, and historical criminologists have plotted them over time. Here we have a number of estimates of homicide rates in various parts of England from the year 1200 to the year 2000, plotted on a logarithmic scale from 1/10 of a homicide per 100,000 per year to 1 to 10 to 100. And as you can see, there's been a massive decline in the homicide rate in England, so that a contemporary Englishman has about 1/35 the chance of being murdered as his medieval ancestors. I think, by the way, that that data point comes from Oxford. This is true not just in England, but in every European country for which data are available. Here we see Italy, Netherlands, Germany, and Switzerland, and Scandinavia. Here we have an average of those 5 regions, and for the sake of comparison, I've also plotted that 524 per 100,000 per year figure from non-state societies. So this gap is what I call the pacification process. This further decline I call the civilizing process. Now, I got the name from the classic book by the German sociologist Norbert Elias, who argued that in the transition from the Middle Ages to modernity, there was a consolidation of central states and kingdoms out of the patchwork of principalities and baronies and duchies that had polka-dotted Europe. With it, criminal justice was nationalized, and the constant feuding and warlord activity of medieval knights gave way to the king's justice. Also during this period, there was a growing infrastructure of commerce, a financial infrastructure of money that was recognized within the boundaries of these newly consolidated kingdoms and other instruments of finance, and a physical infrastructure such as better roads and wagons and instruments of timekeeping, all of which made zero-sum plunder give way to positive-sum trade. And that's a point that I'll return to later in the talk. The third decline of violence can be appreciated by remembering some of the ways that the early kingdoms kept law and order within their kingdoms, namely extreme sadistic forms of corporal punishment, such as breaking on the wheel, burning at the stake, clawing, sawing in half, and impalement. But in a process that's been called the Humanitarian Revolution, these forms of sadistic punishment were abolished. This is a timeline showing the abolition of judicial torture in 16 major countries. The abolitions were centered in the second half of the 18th century, including the prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment in the Eighth Amendment of the American Constitution, which took place right in the middle of this worldwide phenomenon. Also abolished during the Humanitarian Revolution was the profligate use of the death penalty for non-lethal crimes. In 18th century England, there were 222 capital offenses on the books, including poaching, counterfeiting, robbing a rabbit warren, being in the company of gypsies, and, quote, strong evidence of malice in a child 7 to 14 years of age. By 1861, the number of capital crimes had been reduced to 4. Likewise, in 17th and 18th century America, the capital punishment was on the books and used for theft, sodomy, bestiality, adultery, witchcraft, concealing birth, slave revolt, and counterfeiting. Now, of course, the United States continues to have the death penalty, but even in the US, the death penalty is a shadow of its former self. This graph shows the number of American executions per capita from 1650 to the present, and as you can see, the rate has plummeted, so that now about 45 people are executed per year in the United States, a country that has more than 16,000 homicides per year. Elsewhere in the Western world, the death penalty has been abolished outright. Here we have a timeline from 1775 to the present of number of European countries that have capital punishment on the law books. Most of the abolitions took place in the 20th century, but the blue timeline, which shows the number of European countries that actually carry out executions, shows that well before European lawmakers struck capital punishment from the law books, their countries had lost their taste for actually executing people. And on average, 50 years elapsed between the last actual execution and the time that lawmakers got around to striking it from the law books. Also abolished during the Humanitarian Revolution were witch hunts, religious persecution, like burning heretics at the stake, dueling, blood sports, debtors' prisons, and perhaps most famously of all, slavery. Slavery used to be legal everywhere on earth. No one seemed to think there was anything particularly wrong with it. The Bible had no problem with it. Democratic Greece had no problem with it. But then starting in the 18th century, a wave of abolitions began, which finally culminated with the last country to abolish legal slavery, Mauritania, in 1980. And so for the last 30 years, we've been living through a unique period in human history in which slavery has been illegal everywhere on earth. What were the immediate causes of the Humanitarian Revolution? One might have guessed that affluence had something to do with it. Perhaps as your own life becomes more pleasant, you place a higher value on life in general, and by extension, the lives of others. It sounds plausible, but unfortunately, the timing doesn't work. If you look at the rise of affluence over the centuries, at least in countries for which we have data, like England, you see that the standard of living was pretty much flat until the advent of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, at which point it took off, but these humanitarian reforms were centered in the 18th century. A more plausible hypothesis is that the rise of printing and literacy had something to do with it. This graph shows that prior to the 18th century, the economic efficiency of book production went up 25-fold, the only technology that showed a precocious increase in efficiency prior to the Industrial Revolution. That technology was put into practice, and the number of books published per decade increased exponentially during the 18th century, a kind of early version of Moore's Law. And for the first time in history, during the 18th century, a majority of citizens could read those books. That's when literacy exceeded the 50% rate. Why should literacy matter? Well, another name for this era is the Enlightenment, because knowledge began to replace superstition and ignorance. When you have a literate population, they are less likely to harbor toxic beliefs, such as that Jews poison wells, that heretics go to hell, that crop failures are caused by the spells of witches, that children are possessed by the devil, which has to be beaten out of them, that Africans are brutish and only fit for enslavement, and so on. As Voltaire put it, those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. Also, literacy is a technology of cosmopolitanism, of the mixing of people and ideas. And it's plausible that as people consume more fiction and history and journalism, they start to inhabit other people's minds. They enhance the ability to empathize with them, which could expand their sense of empathy and decrease their taste for cruelty. And that's a hypothesis that I'll also return to at the end of the talk. The fourth decline of violence has been called the long peace, and it speaks to the common belief that the 20th century was the most violent in history. It's important to realize, though, that people who make that claim never cite numbers from any century other than the 20th, so this is really a trend based on one data point. And although we don't have good data from previous centuries, there are reasons to be skeptical of it. For one thing, the 19th century, which is usually held out as a peaceful century by contrast, had, just to give a few examples, the Napoleonic Wars with 4 million deaths, one of the most destructive wars in European history. The most destructive civil war in history, the Taiping Rebellion in China, which most of you probably have not heard of, but which killed 20 million people. The most destructive war by far in American history, the Civil War with 650,000. In Africa, the conquests of Shaka Zulu, which killed between 1 and 2 million people. Did I leave any continent out? Oh, yes, South America. That had the War of the Triple Alliance, which killed 60% of the population of Paraguay, making it the most destructive interstate war in history. And then there were slave-raiding wars in Africa and imperial wars in Africa, Asia, and the South Pacific, whose death tolls we can't even begin to estimate. Also, though it's undoubtedly true that the Second World War was the worst single event in human history in terms of the number of people that it killed, it's not so clear that it was necessarily the worst in terms of the percentage of the world's population that was killed. Here we have a graph that I've taken from a man who calls himself an atrocitologist, Matthew White, which is a list of the 100 worst things that people have ever done to each other, which I have scaled by the world population at the time, from 500 BCE to 2000 CE. And as you can see, history's worst atrocities were pretty evenly sprinkled over 2,500 years of human history. World War II only comes in at 9th place, and World War I doesn't even make the top 10. Now, you might notice from this graph that there's a funneling of the data cloud as you get closer to the present. Presumably, this does not mean that in ancient times they only committed really big atrocities, and recently we've committed big and medium-sized and small atrocities. More plausibly, this is just an artifact of the historical record. The closer you get to the present, the more complete the records are. We can put a magnifying glass on the last 500 years, for which there is a data set on the number of deaths in war, coming from the political scientist Jack Levy, who estimated the death toll from wars involving a great power. These are the 800-pound gorillas of the day, the countries and empires that can project military force beyond their own borders. And because war deaths are distributed according to a power law, the death toll from the biggest wars combined accounts for a majority of the death tolls from all wars, big, medium, and small. So I'm going to give you a few graphs that basically summarize world history in a few line graphs. All of them go from the year 1500 to the year 2000. Here we have the proportion of years that great powers fought each other. And as you can see, several centuries ago, the line grazes the ceiling at 100%. Basically, the great powers always fought each other. That's just what great powers did. But more recently, the great powers almost never fight each other. Here is a graph showing the duration of wars involving a great power, which also shows that great power wars have gotten shorter. History used to have things like the 30 Years' War, the 80 Years' War, the 100 Years' War. The 20th century had the Six-Day War. Here we have the frequency of wars involving a great power. How often would a great power pick a fight and start a new war? And that trend has been in decline. There is, however, one trend that went in the opposite direction during most of that period. Namely, once a great power did start a war, how many people were they able to kill per country per year? That is, how deadly were the wars? And that, unfortunately, showed a substantial increase for 450 years. That is, the wars that occurred were deadlier, although that did a U-turn after the Second World War. So we're now living in a period in which the frequency of wars and the duration of wars and the deadliness of wars have all been in decline. If you multiply those three numbers together to get a total death toll, you get a zigzag line, but one whose lowest point corresponds to the last quarter of the 20th century. That is, the last quarter of the 20th century has been the most peaceful period in half a millennium of world history. We can further zoom in on the last 100 years, where the data become clearer yet. And here is a graph of the death toll from all wars combined for the 20th century and the first few years of the 21st. It shows that there were two unmistakable spikes of bloodletting corresponding to the two world wars, but that did not inaugurate a trend, but rather was something more like a last gasp. And since then, the graph has been hugging the floor by world history standards. This is the period that historians have called the long peace, the fact that since 1946, there's been a historically unprecedented decline in interstate war, wars between two countries. There were no wars between the two greatest powers of them all, the United States and Soviet Union, contrary to every expert prediction that World War III was inevitable. No nuclear weapon has been used since Nagasaki, again, contrary to every expert prediction that global thermonuclear war between the US and the Soviet Union was inevitable. There have been no wars between great powers since the end of the Korean War in 1953. No wars between Western European countries, a fact that almost seems obvious to us today. Like, well, of course, no one would ever expect, say, France and Germany to fight a war. But needless to say, this is a historically unusual situation. Before 1945, Western European countries alone started 2 new wars a year for 600 years. As of 1945, that abruptly went to 0. And there have been no wars between developed countries. The 44 countries with the highest GDP per capita have not fought each other in a war since 1945. Again, that almost sounds obvious. Today, we think of war as something that takes place in those poor, godforsaken parts of the world. But for most of human history, it was the big, rich countries that were constantly at each other's throats. And because they could afford big, destructive armies, they did the most damage. Well, what about the rest of the world? I've spoken about rich countries, I've spoken about Europe, I've spoken about great powers. But in a development that I call the new peace, the long peace is starting to spread to the rest of the world. Now, since 1946, I mentioned that there have been fewer interstate wars. There have, however, been more civil wars as newly independent states with inept governments defended themselves from insurgent movements, both sides armed, financed, and egged on by the Cold War superpowers. However, and I'll show you the trend in this graph, this is a stacked layer graph from 1946 to the present, where the thickness of each layer corresponds to the number of wars in each of several categories, and the height of the entire stack corresponds to the total number of wars. For the sake of these graphs, a war is defined as an armed conflict with a government on at least one side that kills as few as 25 people per year. So the first wedge shows the number of colonial wars, which tapered off to 0 as European empires relinquished their overseas colonies. Here we have the number of interstate wars, a government on each side. Here, though, we have the number of pure civil wars, purely involving one country, and internationalized civil wars, where some foreign power butts in on the side, generally on the side of the government. So it shows that there was a bulge in the number of civil wars, but even the number of civil wars started to decline after the fall of the Soviet Empire in 1991. The real question now, though, is not just how many wars there are, but what kind of war kills more people. The old wars between countries or the newer wars within countries. And this graph shows the answer. The blue bars show for each decade since the 1950s the number of people killed per year in interstate wars, which has shown a substantial decline. Here we have the number of people killed per year in internationalized civil wars and in internal civil wars, showing that even the rise of the death toll from civil wars does not make up for the decline in deaths from interstate wars. So again, let me now multiply the number of wars times the number of deaths per war to simply add up the total number of deaths altogether. Again, there's the stacked layer graph shows that the number of deaths in colonial wars, which used to be quite destructive, have tapered off to 0. Here we have the death toll from interstate wars, which shows a bumpy but unmistakable decline with peaks for Korea, Vietnam, and Iran, Iraq. Here's the death toll from the internal civil wars and the internationalized civil wars. If you look at the entire trend, there's a rather bumpy roller coaster, but one with an unmistakable downward trend. And in the 21st century, we see here a thin laminate of layers showing that we're living in a period of unprecedentedly low rate of death in wars of all kinds put together. What were the immediate causes of the long peace and the new peace? Well, among the most influential hypotheses were 3 that were advanced 2 centuries ago by Immanuel Kant in his essay Perpetual Peace, in which he argued that democracy, trade, and an international community all disincentivized leaders from waging war. More recently, Bruce Russett and John O'Neill have put Kant's hypothesis to quantitative test and have shown that all 3 factors increased in the second half of the 20th century. And in a mammoth regression analysis, they showed that all 3 are independent contributors to peace, holding constant every other variable they could think of. So in particular, this graph shows that the number of democracies has increased in the last 2/3 of a century and now exceeds the number of autocracies. Here we see that international trade over the course of the 20th century skyrocketed after the end of the Second World War. And here we see that membership in intergovernmental organizations, a kind of international community, has increased with a big uptick again after the Second World War. Finally, we have the rights revolutions, the targeting of violence on smaller scales directed against vulnerable populations such as racial minorities, women, children, homosexuals, and animals. The civil rights movement, first of all, put an end to the practice of lynching. At the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, 150 African Americans were lynched every year. By the 1950s, that had been brought down to 0. Hate crime murders of blacks have been recorded since the 1990s. They were never very plentiful to begin with, about 5 a year. That has gone down to 1 per year. Non-lethal hate crimes against blacks, such as intimidation and assault, have been in decline. And the kind of racist attitudes that made violence against blacks possible has been in decline. Here we have some data from Larry Bobo, who is in the audience, showing the results of public opinion polls repeated over time that asked white Americans questions like, do you believe that black and white students should go to separate schools? And if a black family moved in next door, would you move out? That has been in steady decline. Now it's in the range of crank opinion, and the questions are no longer even included in the general social survey. This is a worldwide phenomenon. Here we have a graph showing the number of countries worldwide with various apartheid or Jim Crow policies that discriminate against ethnic minorities, which has been in decline. The blue line shows the number of countries with various remedial discrimination or affirmative action policies. So we're now living in a period where more countries have laws that try to help their vulnerable minorities than that discriminate against them. The women's rights movement has seen an 80% decline in the rate of rape since statistics were first kept in the 1970s. A similarly dramatic decline in rates of domestic violence. a decline in the rate of the most extreme form of domestic violence of all, namely uxoricide, the murder of female partners, and mariticide, the murder of male partners. As you can see, the rate of decline is even greater for male victims than for female victims. The feminist movement has been very, very good for husbands. The children's rights movement has seen a steady decline in the number of American states that permit corporal punishment in schools, such as paddling and strapping. In every Western country, approval of spanking as a form of discipline has gone down, and in fact, in some European countries, it has been outlawed and is considered a human rights violation. Rates of child abuse have gone down since statistics were first kept in the 1990s, both physical abuse and sexual abuse. And victimization of children in schools by bullies and involvement in fights has been in decline since data were first kept in the 1990s. The gay rights movement has seen an increase in the number of states that have decriminalized homosexuality, both states worldwide and American states, which now stands at 100%. Anti-gay attitudes have been in steady decline in the West in every public opinion poll. And the hate crime of intimidation has been in decline since it was first measured in the 1990s. The animal rights movement has seen a decline in hunting, an increase in vegetarianism, both in the UK and in the US, and a dramatic decline in the number of motion pictures in which animals were harmed. Well, now the question is, why has violence declined on so many scales of time and magnitude? Could it be that human nature itself has changed, and somehow our inclinations toward violence have literally been bred out of us? Well, there are a number of reasons to think that this is unlikely. Among them are we continue to see violence in children. The most violent age in life is 2. And one of the great universal sex differences, perhaps the most robust one, is that little boys like to play, fight, and engage in rough and tumble play. Grown-up little boys continue to take enjoyment in vicarious violence, including murder mysteries, Greek tragedies, Shakespearean dramas, video games, ice hockey, and movies starring a certain ex-governor of California. And then there are homicidal fantasies. A number of social psychologists have posed the following question to their participants. Have you ever fantasized about killing someone you don't like? Think about it. Well, the results are that about 15% of women and 1/3 of men frequently fantasize about killing people. And about 60% of women and 3/4 of men at least occasionally think about killing people. Well, what does this have to say about human nature? It says that about 1/4 of men and 30% of women are liars. A more likely possibility is that human nature is extraordinarily complex, and it has always comprised inclinations toward violence and inclinations that counteract them, what Abraham Lincoln called the better angels of our nature, and that historical circumstances have increasingly favored our peaceable inclinations. Well, what are they? Here is a very quick inventory of I think, the kinds of neurobiological motives for violence. There's just raw exploitation, eliminating a person that happens to be an obstacle on the path towards something that you want, resulting in rape, plunder, conquest, and the elimination of inconvenient rivals. There's dominance, the urge among individuals to climb the pecking order and become alpha male, and the corresponding conflict among groups for ethnic, racial, religious, or national supremacy. There's moralistic violence or revenge, the idea that you are obligated to harm someone who has committed some sin or infraction, resulting in vendettas, rough justice, and cruel punishments. And then there are violent ideologies, such as those of militant religions, nationalism, Nazism, and communism, which can license vast amounts of violence through a kind of utopian cost-benefit analysis. If your belief system holds out the prospect of a world that will be infinitely good forever, well, if the ends are infinitely good, then the means can be as violent as you want, and you always are ahead of the game. Also, imagine that you have announced your plans for a perfect world, and there are some people who just don't get with the program. For they stand in your way, they oppose you. Well, they're the only things that are standing in the way of a world that will be infinitely good forever. How evil are they? Well, you do the math. And that's why, paradoxically, some of the most destructive events of violence in human history have been motivated by idealistic utopian ideologies. Well, what do we have on the other side to counteract these violent inclinations? What are the better angels of our nature? There's self-control, circuitry in the prefrontal cortex that can anticipate the consequences of behavior and inhibit our violent impulses. There's empathy, the ability to feel others' pain. There's the moral sense, a system of norms and taboos that regulate behavior. And there's reason, cognitive processes, Danny Kahneman calls them system 2, that can engage in objective, detached analysis. So now the question becomes, which historical developments have shifted the balance toward our better angels and have stayed our hands before they can commit acts of bloodshed? The first hypothesis is that Hobbes got it right when he called for a leviathan, a state and judicial system with a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. A leviathan can eliminate the incentives for exploitative attack by penalizing aggression and therefore canceling out the anticipated gain of an aggressor. That can calm everyone down because not only are you disincentivized from committing acts of aggression, but you know that your neighbors are too. And so that reduces the need for a preemptive attack to do it to them before they do it to you, to maintain a belligerent stance for deterrence, or to carry out vengeance after the fact. And in doing so, it circumvents the self-serving biases that social psychology has shown that our species is vulnerable to, where both sides always believe that their opponent's attacks are acts of naked aggression out of the blue, but their own attacks are justified retaliation after the fact. You allow both sides to think that, and you can get endless cycles of vendetta and revenge, which can be preempted by a disinterested third party. Some historical evidence include the pacifying and civilizing effects of states that I alluded to at the beginning of the talk, and the fact that you can watch this movie run in reverse when states retreat, leaving behind zones of anarchy, which are inevitably violent, such as the American Wild West, where you all remember the cliche from the cowboy movies, the nearest sheriff is 120 miles away, so you have to defend yourself with your six-shooter. Failed states, collapsed empires, and zones that are controlled by mafias and street gangs that deal in contraband, where, say, if you're a cocaine dealer and you think you've been cheated in a business deal, it's not as if you can press a lawsuit. If you feel threatened, you can't dial 911. Your only security is the credible threat of violence. Second hypothesis is the theory of gentle commerce, du commerce, according to which plunder is a zero-sum game. The victor's gain is the vanquished's loss, but trade is a positive-sum game, one in which everybody wins, a kind of reciprocal altruism. And that as improving technology allows the trade of goods and ideas over longer distances, among larger groups of people, and at lower cost, more and more of the rest of the world becomes more valuable to you alive than dead. Much has been written about the rivalry between the United States and China, but still, I think most experts think it's highly unlikely that they will actually go to war. Among other things, they make all our stuff. We owe them too much money. Some historical evidence comes from regression analyses that show that holding all other variables constant, countries with more open economies and a greater dependence on international trade get embroiled in fewer wars, are riven by fewer civil wars, and host fewer genocides. A third hypothesis, the expanding circle, originated by Charles Darwin but named by the philosopher Peter Singer, is that evolution installed in all of us a sense of empathy, but unfortunately, by default, we apply that empathy only to a very narrow circle of friends, blood relatives, and cute little baby animals. But over the course of history, one can see the circle expanding to embrace the village, then the clan, then the tribe, the nation, other races, both sexes, children, and perhaps eventually other species. Well, that just begs the question of what expanded the circle, and it's plausible that technologies of increased cosmopolitanism are the answer. That as people consume more history, literature, and journalism, they get into the habit of adopting the perspective of other people. And indeed, a number of experiments have shown that if you induce subjects in the lab to read the words or hear the voice of another person, real or fictitious, that not only expands your sympathy toward that person, but toward the entire category of people that that individual represents. Some historical evidence is that humanitarian reforms have often been preceded by new technologies for the spread of ideas. The Humanitarian Revolution of the 18th century, as I mentioned, was preceded by the Republic of Letters, the expansion of written discourse. The long peace and rights revolutions of the 20th century occurred in the era of the electronic global village. And though it's too soon to say whether the color revolutions in the Arab Spring will have a happy ending, it's almost a cliche to note that those were enabled by the rise of the internet and social media. Finally, there's the escalator of reason, the possibility that the expansion of literacy, education, and public discourse have encouraged people to think more abstractly and more universally. That is, they rise above their parochial vantage points. That makes it harder to privilege your own interests over others, just because, say, I'm me and you're not. It encourages people to stand back and recognize the futility of cycles of violence and increasingly see violence as a problem to be solved rather than as a contest to be won. Some historical evidence comes from the equally surprising phenomenon that abstract reasoning abilities, as measured by IQ tests, have increased over the course of the 20th century, the so-called Flynn effect, by which IQ scores have increased by 3 points a decade for most of the 20th century. Other studies have shown that holding all other variables constant, people and societies with higher levels of education and measured intelligence commit fewer violent crimes, cooperate more in experimental games, have more classically liberal attitudes, such as opposition to racism, sexism, and homophobia, and those countries are more receptive to democracies 10 years down the line. Well, the final question I'll raise is, having presented 4 hypotheses as to what may have pushed rates of violence down, why did all these forces seem to push in the same direction? And my hunch is that the common denominator is that violence is a social dilemma in the game theorist sense. That is, it's always tempting to an aggressor to exploit a victim, but of course it's far more ruinous to the victim. Since in the long run, victims and aggressors tend to trade places, everyone would be better off if everyone could somehow agree to abjure violence. The dilemma is, how do you get the other guy to agree to refrain from violence at the same time as you do? Because if you turn your swords into plowshares, but the other guy keeps his as swords, then you could find yourself at the wrong end of a sword point. It's not unreasonable to think that over the course of history, human experience and human ingenuity have gradually chipped away at this problem, just like we've tried to handle other scourges of the human condition, like pestilence and hunger. And the common denominator of those 4 forces is that all of them serve to increase the material, emotional, or cognitive incentives of all parties to avoid violence simultaneously. Well, whatever the best explanation of the decline of violence turns out to be, I think it has implications that are profound. For one thing, it calls for a reorientation of our efforts toward violence reduction from a moralistic mindset to an empirical mindset. That is, instead of lamenting, why is there war, perhaps instead we should be asking, why is there peace? Not just what are we doing wrong, but what have we been doing right? Because we have been doing something right, and it seems to me to be rather important to try to figure out what exactly it is. Also, I think the decline of violence calls for a reassessment of modernity, of the centuries-long trend that has eroded family, tribe, tradition, and religion, and has replaced them with individualism, cosmopolitanism, reason, and science. Now, everyone acknowledges the gifts of modernity. longer and healthier lives, less ignorance and superstition, richer experiences. But there's always been a current of nostalgia and romanticism that questions the price. Is it worth it if we have to live in the shadow of terrorism, genocide, world wars, and nuclear weapons? If, however, despite impressions, the long-term trend, though halting and incomplete, is that violence of all kinds is decreasing, I think that calls for a rehabilitation of the ideals of modernity and progress, and it's certainly a cause for gratitude for the institutions of civilization and enlightenment that have made it possible. Thank you very much. Okay.
So please, Steve, just...
Yeah, okay, we have one over there. And will the microphone find its way to the questioner? Yeah.
Thanks for a really fascinating talk. It seems to me, I mean, there is this discipline of peace and conflict studies out there with several well-known institutions around the world. And it seems to me rather obvious that you have, like, solved some of the problems or addressed some of the questions that people in this area perhaps should have addressed themselves. What is your relationship to this discipline?
Yeah.
Do they feel that you have been on their turf? Are they supportive of your findings?
Well, it's gone the other way around in that I've relied on their findings to a great extent. So a number of the graphs that I presented, they went by very quickly, and the fine print was especially illegible given the low contrast of the projection in this room. But the graphs on rates of death in international war came from the Peace Research Institute of Oslo and the Uppsala Conflict Data Project, two of the foremost centers for peace and conflict research, at which I've spoken, and I've been asked to join the board of one of them, so we're kind of in cahoots. And I think this has been I think they are an undervalued and essential, very small component of the social sciences. And what I especially value is that they have done their best to try to quantify changes over time in rates of organized violence in various categories and to test hypotheses. That is, as best you can test hypotheses in this field, namely to do various cross-lagged correlations and so on. So yeah, very close relationship. Yes.
Thanks again for a wonderful talk. According to the World Health Organization, the leading and fastest growing cause of violent human death is suicide. I wonder how that factors into your analysis.
Yeah, I haven't, I decided, although the book spans a lot of categories of violence, I did not include suicide. Largely because it's, as a category of violence, it's one that does seem different in that the victim and the perpetrator are the same. It's a voluntary act. And so it didn't seem to be in this, even though, of course, it's regrettable, it struck me as more of a public health problem than a violence problem. It's more deplorable than evil. Though it would be interesting to look at secular changes in rates of suicide as well, but that just wasn't one. I decided to exclude that from the topics of this book. Yes?
Yes, you can imagine that the factors that you mentioned.
Can people hear, or should we wait till the microphone floats over?
You can imagine that the factors you mentioned could have the reverse causal direction. What sort of reciprocal relationship do you see between declines in violence and the rise of trade, the rise of reason, democracy, and so forth, so that you have a back and forth causal relationship?
No, and all of these hypotheses have your typical social science nightmare of kind of everything causing everything else. And in general, especially in comparisons among countries, you basically have in all of these comparisons a kind of, I think of it as the Sweden to Somalia continuum, where there are some parts of the world where everything is great. They're rich, they're at peace, they don't get involved in wars, they don't have murders, the women are equal, they're educated, and then there are parts of the world that just suck, where all of those variables in the other direction, and the question is, what is the first domino? So some of these studies do their best to try to untangle that by at least the first step of correlating something at a putative cause at time 1 with a putative effect at time 2. Now, I don't have to tell you that doesn't solve the problem, but it takes a step in that direction. And so for example, the Russett and O'Neill analysis that tried to argue that trade, democracy, and membership in an international community were causal and not just correlated, were time-lagged. Again, it's not bulletproof. And I suspect even if one can show a causal relationship in one direction, it probably goes in the other direction as well. Democracy may be a luxury that you can afford when your country is not under external threat. It might be easier to have an infrastructure of trade when you're not, the defense establishment isn't sucking up all your infrastructure and so on. Okay.
Yeah, could you comment on Samuel P. Huntington's book, The Class of Civilizations, and the remaking of the world order in the context of what you've shared today?
Yeah, there is. It's probably not a very accurate way of summarizing trends in war and peace. That there have been too many wars within civilizations, and although as Huntington defines them, such as among Arab or Islamic countries, I should say. So, for example, there was the worst interstate war of the last several decades was the Iran-Iraq war. That wasn't a clash of Islam versus the rest of the world, but it was a kind of Islam kind of thing. And there are still, and likewise, there are wars within non-Islamic civilization. So it doesn't really sort the data into the peaceful versus non-peaceful dyads. It is true, though, Huntington famously said that Islam has bloody borders and that a lot of the conflicts did occur between Islamic and non-Islamic states. I have a graph in the book that looks at the rate of wars involving an Islamic country. And the grain of truth to that is that while the rate of war in the rest of the world was declining, the rate of war involving Islamic countries has been flat. So as a proportion of the extant conflicts, the percentage that's been Islamic has increased, but it's not because there have been more wars involving Islamic countries. It's just that the decline of violence in the rest of the world is something that the Islamic world has kind of been sitting out. And that's true of a number of quantitative measures that Islamic countries still have extreme forms of corporal punishment, many of them. There are much higher rates of capital punishment, lower rates of democracy, and so on. So the grain of truth is that there is a bit of a lag, but not that it's gotten worse, just that it hasn't gotten better.
So, sorry, go ahead. Okay.
Okay, go ahead. You've got the mic.
So a lot of the analysis that you've done, especially in the earlier part of your talk, is based on rates, per capita.
Rates, yes.
And it's not so much that the numerators are decreasing, but rather the denominators are overwhelming the numerators in terms of the size of the population. Do you see any factors that might drive the numerators to decrease over the next years or decades?
Well, in many cases, the numerators have decreased as well, such as in war deaths. So the graphs that I showed were per capita, but if you have them in an absolute scale and you just tally the deaths, the slope goes up a bit, but there's still a dramatic decline just counting bodies. And doing it per capita just makes it that much more dramatic. In general, a number of people can't wrap their minds around the fact that I think none of these are meaningful in absolute numbers, that it really has to be per capita. But that having been said, some of them are actually in absolute numbers as well. Because if you have a population of a country that's expanded tenfold, then if the number of homicides were to stay the same, that means that if you were a randomly selected member of that country, citizen of that country, you'd be much less likely to get murdered. And just about any way you think about it, you end up with rates as the relevant way of assessing trends in violence. Yes, we have a question over here. Okay.
Could you say a bit more about your concerns about what could go wrong?
Yeah.
For many people in security studies, the spread of nuclear weapons or biological weapons to personalistic authoritarian regimes or to terrorists are what people spend their time working to prevent. Is that the right nightmare that we should be worrying about, or are there other broader trends that you're thinking about?
Yeah, just about anything that you can extrapolate based on current variables looks positive. And the peace and conflict researchers, in plugging in global trends that are predictors of war, show that the world, on average, ought to continue to get more peaceful. However, I would identify as the main threat the unknown unknowns. The terrorist group that no one has heard of that appears out of the blue, some country that is taken over by some charismatic ideologue who decides that it would be a good idea to, some leader in China who decides that the historic injustice of Taiwan ought to be rectified once and for all. We may not know who he is. He may be low in the kind of the equivalent of the Politburo and working his way up at this very moment. I think a lot of those scenarios are highly unlikely, but there are a bunch of them. And the problem is that those black swans, low probability, high impact, are what we have to worry about. And they would include nuclear terrorism. Although I have a discussion of nuclear terrorism in the book, and it would be foolish to say that it's impossible, but what I argue is that the predictions that it's inevitable are equally foolish. And I have a paper trail of predictions by experts that with certainty a nuclear device would be exploded by a terrorist group no later than 1998. Well, okay, no later than 2003. Mark my words, 2005, it'll definitely happen. So you don't want to get complacent about it, but even though this is definitely something to worry about, I don't think it's a certainty, as is often claimed.
Right. We have
Okay, I think we have a long...
One more, last one.
Yeah.
I think this is right, that over time, if violence has been declining, population has also been increasing. So is that in your book? Have you thought that through?
Yes. Is the question whether a more crowded world should be more or less violent, or more how you calculate rates of violence absolutely or per capita?
No, that there is some sort of causal relationship between there being more people in the world and
being less violent. Yeah, no, that's an easy one. There isn't. That is the old idea coming from those studies where if you put a lot of rats together in a cage, they start to bite each other more. That is just not true of humans. If it were... Pardon me? Oh, does it make them more peaceful? It's probably not enough to make them more peaceful. But this is a popular idea in the 1960s, that overpopulation would lead to greater violence, and everyone studied the rat studies. If that were true, then the most violent place on earth would be Hong Kong, and the least violent place would be Sudan. But neither of those is true.
And thank you very much.
Thanks.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.